The last thing Eli Harding expected when he rode home through the October dark was light in his kitchen window. He'd been out since before sunrise mending the north fence line after a night of wind that had knocked 3 posts clean from the frozen earth. 18 hours in the saddle. His back ached in that particular way it always did in autumn, the old wound from Chickamauga tightening like a fist around his left shoulder blade, and all he'd wanted was cold cornbread and silence and the mercy of sleep. He'd had 20 years of it, silence, cold food, merciful sleep without anyone to disturb the particular quiet he had built around himself like a fortress. 20 years of coming home to a dark house and eating alone and telling himself this was fine, this was enough. This was all a man like him deserved. So the yellow glow spilling through the kitchen curtains stopped him at the gate like a bullet. Eli sat his horse for a long moment, the animal shifting beneath him, breath steaming in the cold. He'd left no lantern lit. He never did. There was no one to light lanterns for. He dismounted without making a sound. Old habits, war habits tied the horse at the post and drew his rifle from the scabbard in one smooth motion. His boots made no noise on the frost-hardened ground as he crossed the yard. Through the window he could see the silhouette of a woman moving through his kitchen with the unhurried certainty of someone who had every right to be there. He pushed the door open. The smell hit him first. Roasted meat potatoes, fresh bread, warm and rich, and so achingly familiar that his chest clenched against his will. His mother had cooked like this, in another life, in another century, before everything he'd touched had turned to ash and silence. The woman stood at his stove, her back to him, stirring a pot with the calm efficiency of someone who had cooked 10,000 meals. She wore an apron over a dark traveling dress, his mother's apron, the one he kept folded in the kitchen drawer, the one he'd never been able to throw away and never been able to use. She'd found it and put it on like it was the most natural thing in the world. On his table sat 2 plates, 2 forks, 2 cups of water poured and waiting. 2. The rifle came up before he even thought about it. "Put the knife down," he said. His voice came out rough. Weeks of not using it for anything but commanding cattle had scraped it raw. The woman set the paring knife on the counter without flinching. She turned to face him slowly, her movements unhurried, and Eli got his first look at her. Dark hair pinned back, a few strands loose around her face from the heat of the stove. Eyes that were darker still, the kind of eyes that had seen something and kept going anyway. She was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years older, with the kind of face that had been beautiful once and was now something better than beautiful certain. She looked at the rifle without fear. That unsettled him more than anything else. "My name is Maren Ashby," she said. Her voice was steady, the accent Eastern Boston or close to it. "I'm the new school teacher. I arrived in Sweetwater Basin 3 days ago. And you decided to break into my house." The door was unlocked. Eli's jaw tightened. "That don't make it yours." "I know." She met his eyes without flinching. "But I made you supper anyway." The smell of roasted meat reached him again. His stomach twisted with a hunger he'd been ignoring for the last 18 hours. He lowered the rifle, though he didn't set it down. "You got 10 seconds, he said, "to explain why I shouldn't ride into town and fetch Sheriff Holt." "Because you won't." Her voice carried no arrogance, only a calm certainty that was somehow worse. "Sheriff Holt told me you're an honest man. He said if anyone in this territory would let a stranger stay a single night without harm, it would be Eli Harding. Holt's got a loose tongue. He was trying to be kind. Kind gets people hurt." Eli set the rifle against the wall and crossed his arms. "Where did you get the food?" "I brought supplies from Boston, more than I needed for the journey." She turned back to the stove without asking permission and ladled the stew into both bowls. "I wasn't sure what I'd find when I arrived." "And what did you find?" "A town that doesn't trust outsiders." She carried both bowls to the table with the steady hands of a woman who'd long stopped being surprised by difficult circumstances. "A schoolhouse with a leaking roof and a broken stove. And a sheriff who told me the teacher's cottage won't be ready for 2 weeks in Mrs. Caldwell at the church offered me a room in exchange for attending 3 services Sunday and helping with every charity function through Christmas." Eli pulled out the chair, his chair, the one he'd sat in alone for 20 years, and lowered himself into it. He stared at the bowl of stew steaming in front of him. "So you figured I wouldn't notice," he said. "I figured you wouldn't care." He looked up at her. She'd sat across from him, hands folded in her lap, watching him with those dark eyes that held something he couldn't quite name. Not pity, not hope. Something quieter and more dangerous than either. "I care," he said. "Then I'll leave tonight." She started to rise. "Sit down." The words came out before he'd decided to say them. He picked up the fork and pointed it at her. "You can leave after you eat, and after you answer one more question." She sat. "Ask. You said you were the new school teacher. What happened to Miss Burrell?" "She married a rancher from Cody County and moved in November." Maren picked up her own fork. "The position has been empty since. I applied in August." "Why Wyoming?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice stayed level, but something shifted behind it, the way water looks calm until you see the current underneath. "I had a husband," she said. "He died 2 years ago." The silence stretched between them. Eli took another bite. The stew was extraordinary, not just good, but the kind of cooking that carried memory in it, that reached past the present moment into something older and more painful. "I'm sorry," he said, because there was nothing else. "So am I." She looked at him directly. "But his family had ideas about what my grief should look like and where I should live through it. Wyoming was far enough from Boston to make their opinions difficult to enforce." Eli understood running. He'd been doing it for 20 years in a different direction, not toward distance, but toward silence, toward the particular solitude of a man who decided the safest thing he could do was stop mattering to anyone. "The teacher's cottage," he said. 2 weeks. 14 days. She held his gaze. "I'll stay out of your way." He pushed his empty bowl away. His stomach felt full for the first time in months, and the fullness brought an ache he'd spent 2 decades learning to ignore, the ache of being fed by someone who'd thought to set a second plate. "There are rules," he said. "I expected as much. You cook, I handle the ranch. You don't ask questions I don't volunteer answers to. You leave at the end of 2 weeks with no argument and no extension." He stood and picked up his rifle. "The bedroom's yours. I'll sleep in the barn." "That's your bed?" "It's also my house. I'll make the arrangements I see fit." He was at the door when she spoke again. "Mr. Harding." He stopped but didn't turn. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "The cold gets serious in October. You may regret choosing this over Mrs. Caldwell's parlor." He walked out into the Wyoming night. The stars were out, indifferent and vast, the kind of sky that had no opinion about human suffering. Eli had spent years finding comfort in that indifference. Tonight it sat differently, not comforting, but empty, the way a room feels when someone has just left it. He stood at the fence for a long time, listening to the silence that had been his only company for 2 decades. Inside, through the kitchen window, he could see the soft glow of the lantern and the shadow of a woman moving through his house, like she already knew where everything was. He checked the horses, inspected the water trough, did everything he could think of to delay the return to that house in that particular unsettling warmth. The temperature dropped, and his shoulder ached, and his bed called to him from across the yard, occupied now by a woman with Boston vowels and his mother's apron and eyes that didn't flinch at rifle barrels. When he finally pushed the door open, Maren Ashby was sitting by the banked fire with a book open in her lap. She'd changed into a simple nightgown and wrapped herself in one of the quilts from the cedar chest. She'd found that too, apparently. She'd also cleaned the kitchen. Every dish washed, the table cleared, the pots scoured and stacked. "I told you the bedroom," he said, "and I told you I wasn't taking your bed." She closed the book without looking up. "I've slept in worse places than a clean floor with a fire." Eli studied her for a moment. There was no argument worth making to a woman who'd already made up her mind. He recognized stubbornness when he saw it had been told often enough that he was built entirely out of it. "The fire will be out by midnight," he said. "Then I'll add wood at midnight." He went to the bedroom and lay down on top of the covers without undressing, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person alive in his space. The creak of the chair as she shifted, the soft turn of a page, the particular silence of someone reading, not empty silence, but inhabited silence, full and present, in a way that was different from anything he'd heard in 20 years. He didn't sleep. When the gray Wyoming dawn began to show at the window, Eli got up and found Maren already awake, coffee brewing on the stove. She'd folded the quilt in a precise square and set it on the chair. Her bag sat packed by the door. "I was going to make you breakfast." she said, but I wasn't sure if you'd rather I didn't. He poured himself a cup and stood at the window looking out at the frost on the pasture grass. You can cook breakfast. You sure? You're going to anyway. He looked at her. You're not the kind of woman who asks permission before she's already had decided. The smallest thing moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Thomas used to say the same thing. Thomas, the dead husband. Eli filed that away and didn't press it. She made eggs and cornbread, and they ate in silence, the kind of silence two people fall into when they've run out of opening moves and haven't yet started playing the real game. After she washed the dishes, she picked up her bag. I meant to leave at first light, she said. Eli set his cup down slowly. He looked at her, standing in the kitchen doorway, straight-backed and composed, the winter sun cutting across her face and catching the copper threads in her dark hair. 3 days she'd been in Sweetwater Basin. In those 3 days, she'd apparently assessed the housing situation, interviewed the sheriff, identified the most practical option available to her, and executed her plan with remarkable efficiency. He should send her away. He'd built the solitude of the last 20 years with careful intention, sealing off every crack through which something living might slip in and take root. He knew exactly what it cost to let something grow in a place that had been dark for too long. It cost everything eventually when it died. Put the bag down, he said. She stilled. 2 weeks, he said. That's what you told Holt. He turned back to the window. I changed my mind, but the rules stand. He heard her set the bag down, heard the quiet exhale she tried to keep contained. 2 weeks, she said, and you leave at the end of them. Understood. Don't thank me. I know better by now, said them. The first 3 days passed in the careful choreography of two people learning not to collide. Eli left before dawn and returned after dark. Maren cooked, cleaned, and organized, and by all evidence, had begun walking the mile into town each morning to assess the schoolhouse and introduce herself to families who would eventually send her their children. They took dinner together in near silence. 2 plates on the table. The echo of that first night made ordinary by repetition. On the 4th morning, Eli came in from checking the north fence line and found her standing in his mother's garden plot, hands on her hips, staring at the earth with an expression of focused assessment. This soil's good, she said without turning around. Deep topsoil, good drainage from the slope. Why aren't you growing anything? Don't have time for gardens. You have time. She crouched and pressed her fingers into the earth. You just don't make it. Difference between those two things is my business. He felt the irritation flare at the accuracy of it mostly. You're here 2 weeks. Not long enough to plant anything. Maren stood and brushed the dirt from her hands. Long enough to turn the soil and get it ready. Whoever lives here can plant in spring. She paused. Even if it's just you. She walked past him toward the house. Eli stood looking at the garden plot, 20 years of weeds, and neglect the iron fence his father had built. Still standing the soil where his mother had grown beans and tomatoes and herbs that smelled like summer, even in memory. He felt something he hadn't expected, shame. Not for letting it go, he'd had 20 years to get used to that, but for the fact that a woman who'd been in his house 4 days could see it clearly when he'd long since stopped looking. That night at dinner, Maren was quieter than usual. Eli ate 3 bites before he spoke. I apologize, he said. She looked up surprised. For what I said about the garden. He set his fork down. That wasn't called for. You weren't wrong, it's your land. My mother kept that garden. After she died, I let it go. He looked at his hands. I should have done something with it long before now. If you want to work it, go ahead. Tools are in the barn, 2nd shelf on the left. Maren was quiet for a moment. I don't want to overstep again. You're not overstepping. I'm telling you to. She nodded once, her expression careful. I'll need seeds too eventually. General store in town, put it on my account. They finished dinner in the kind of quiet that had shifted its character from careful to something closer to comfortable. After the dishes were done, Maren sat across from him instead of retreating to her book, and the directness of it startled him. Can I ask you something, she said. Depends. Sheriff Holt mentioned you were in the war. She held his gaze. Which side? Union. He turned his cup in his hands. Wyoming wasn't a state yet. I enlisted in '62. Thomas died at Shiloh. Her voice didn't crack. I never got to bury him. They sent me a letter and his pocket watch. The air between them changed, filled with the particular gravity of shared unfixable loss. Eli had known war widows, had carried telegrams himself, had seen the moment the news arrived in someone's eyes, had spent years trying to forget that he'd had a hand in making some of those telegrams necessary. "Did you see much action?" she asked. He looked at her. She wasn't asking the way civilians usually asked, with a fascinated, queasy curiosity hoping for drama. She was asking the way someone asks who already knows the answer is complicated and has decided they can hear it anyway. "Chickamauga," he said. "Missionary Ridge. I was a sergeant by the end." He paused. "I gave an order at Chickamauga that got 3 of my men killed. I've never been able to decide if it was the right call or the wrong one. I've had 20 years to think about it, and I still don't know." Maren was quiet for a long moment. "Thomas wrote me letters," she said finally, from the front. "He wrote that the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the weight of other men's lives on your decisions. He said that some nights he couldn't sleep because he'd chosen to move his company east instead of west, and spent all night wondering what would have happened to the men he'd left covering the other flank." She looked at him steadily. He said living with uncertainty was the price of command. Eli hadn't heard anyone describe it that way before. Hadn't heard anyone describe it in a way that made it feel less like a personal failing and more like an occupational cost of war. "He sounds like he was a thoughtful man," Eli said. "He was," her voice softened. "We married young. We were friends first more than anything else. I'm not sure we'd had enough time to become fully known to each other before he left." She looked at her hands. "All I have now are possibilities. What we might have been, and a pocket watch that stopped at 2:47. The moment he..." Yes, Eli sat with that. The specificity of it, 2:47, the particular cruelty of grief that attached itself to numbers and objects, and refused to let time be abstract. "Why did you really choose my house?" he asked. "Not Holt's reason, yours." Maren looked at him for a long moment before she answered. "Because I've spent 2 years in rooms full of people who felt sorry for me," she said. "In every room like that, I stopped being Maren and became Thomas Ashby's widow. A role, a situation." She held his gaze. "Holt told me you were the loneliest man in the territory, and I thought a man that lonely either hates company or he's forgotten what it was worth. Either way, there'd be no pity in your kitchen." Eli looked at her across his mother's old table in the kitchen that still smelled faintly of his mother's dried herbs from a rack that had been empty for 2 decades in the house where he had perfected the art of taking up as little space as possible. "There's no pity," he confirmed. "I know." She smiled, then briefly, just enough to change the landscape of her face. "That's why I stayed." The next morning, before Eli had finished his coffee, Maren was in the garden with the spade from the barn, attacking the packed, weedy earth with a methodical fury. He watched her from the kitchen window for longer than he should have, then went outside and picked up the second spade. She glanced up, said nothing. He said nothing either. They worked side by side in the cold October morning for 3 hours, turning soil and pulling roots, and breaking up 20 years of neglect into something that might, with patience, become productive again. Neither spoke much, but the silence was different from every other silence Eli had carried. It had company in it, shared weight instead of solitary burden. When they finally stopped, his hands were filthy and his shoulder ached, and the garden plot looked entirely different. "Ready." "You didn't have to," Maren said, slightly breathless. "Figured you'd plant the beans in the wrong place." She laughed. It was the first real laugh he'd heard from her, full and unguarded, catching him off guard. And something in Eli's chest did a thing it had not done in a very long time. It loosened, not much, just enough to feel the difference. "I'll need stakes for the tomatoes," she said when she caught her breath. "There's old fence posts in the barn. And I was thinking about herbs along the southern edge. They'd get the most sun. Perennials will come back every year if you plant them right." She looked at him with those dark eyes. "Even if no one's tending them." The question sat between them with more weight than gardening warranted. "Someone should," he said, and didn't look away. So when Sunday came the way trouble always does, inevitable, announced in advance, and worse than anticipated. Maren appeared in the kitchen doorway that morning in a dark blue wool dress that made her look like exactly what she was: a schoolteacher and a widow, respectable and composed and about to walk into a room that had already decided what to think of her. I need to attend services, she said, and I need you to come with me. I don't do church. I know. She held his gaze. But I'm a woman who has been living in a bachelor's house for a week, and if I walk into that church alone, Mrs. Caldwell will have me ruined or remarried before the first hymn ends. Please. A pause. 1 hour. Eli looked at her. She wasn't asking him to protect her reputation. She was asking him to stand beside her while she refused to be ashamed of a choice that was nobody's business. There was a difference, and he recognized it. 1 hour, he said. Then we leave. He put on his cleanest shirt, which was not particularly clean, and they rode into Sweetwater Basin in the wagon with the early sun cold and pale behind the mountains. Maren sat straight on the bench seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the road ahead. You're nervous, she said. I'm not. Your jaw's been clenched since we left the fence line. He made a deliberate effort to unclench it. I don't like crowds. Neither do I, but we'll get through it faster together. The church was already full when they pushed through the doors. The sound of conversation died in sections, the way a field goes quiet when something moves through grass. Every eye tracked their progress down the aisle with the particular intensity of people who have waited all week for something to discuss. They took a seat in the back row. Eli sat on the outside, which put him between Maren and the rest of the congregation, which was not accidental. Reverend Price began his sermon on the subject of Christian charity, a selection that under the circumstances landed with the ambiguity of a stone thrown through a window. Around them the whispers gathered like weather, living under the same roof as a man she barely knows. Poor widower probably doesn't know what's come into his house. Mrs. Caldwell says she refused a proper Christian home. Eli felt Maren's spine go rigid beside him. He reached over without thinking and covered her hand where it was clenched white-knuckled in her lap. Her fingers unclenched slowly and wrapped around his palm, holding on with the quiet pressure of someone who was keeping themselves together through will alone. They sat like that through the entire service, hand in hand in the back row while the town cataloged their sins. Eli stared at the altar and breathed evenly, and did not care, not for a single moment, what any of these people thought. What surprised him was that this feeling, this absolute indifference to the congregation's opinion, had not existed until Maren Ashby's hand was in his. It was something about the not being alone of it. After the final hymn, they attempted to leave quickly. Mrs. Caldwell blocked their path in the aisle, her face arranged in the particular expression of a woman who has convinced herself that cruelty is kindness. Miss Ashby, she said warmly, we were so hoping you'd found more suitable accommodation. The church ladies remain willing to host you properly. Mrs. Harding's household has been more than adequate, Maren said. A flicker crossed Mrs. Caldwell's face. Mrs. Harding has been gone for many years, dear. Then Mr. Harding has learned to run an excellent household in her absence. Maren's voice was pleasant, unruffled, and left no opening whatsoever. Mrs. Caldwell's smile didn't waver, but her eyes did. Well, some people have different standards of propriety, I suppose. And some people find it an acceptable use of a Sunday morning, Eli said quietly, to spend it minding other people's business. Mrs. Caldwell's face flushed red. She swept away in a rustle of expensive fabric, and Eli guided Maren toward the door, one hand at her back, before the next volley could be organized. Outside, Sheriff Holt was waiting beside their wagon with the expression of a man who had been debating with himself about whether to say something. Miss Ashby, he removed his hat. Eli, I want you to know the school board met yesterday. Mrs. Caldwell and 2 board members raised some concerns about, he paused, about the appropriateness of your housing situation. I told them it was respectable and that you were a grown woman making her own choices. Thank you, Sheriff, Maren said. I wanted you to hear it from me first. He put his hat back on. There's likely to be more discussion. I can't predict how it goes. I appreciate the warning. They climbed into the wagon. As Eli picked up the reins, he was aware of the eyes on their backs from the church steps calculating cataloging already composing the week's gossip. Maren said nothing for the first mile. When she finally spoke, her voice had the careful control of someone keeping fury at a manageable temperature. They looked at you like you were something to be pitied, she said. They've been doing that for 20 years. And you let them, you let a thing go long enough, you stop seeing it. He kept his eyes on the road. What they think of me stopped mattering about the time I came back from the war and realized the man who'd left wasn't the one who came home. Maren was quiet for a moment. What happened to the man who left? He had the comfortable idea that his decisions were right and his cause was clear, and that what he did in the field could be judged by civilized standards. Eli pulled the wagon to a stop in the middle of the empty road and turned to face her. The words came out with more weight than he'd planned. That man died at Chickamauga. What came back was something quieter and harder and a lot less certain about anything. He looked at her directly. That's not a complaint. It's just what's true. And when I came back and tried to go to church and attend dinners and pretend I was the same Eli Harding who'd left the pity in people's eyes was worse than anything I'd seen in the field. Maren looked at him with those eyes that didn't flinch and didn't soften into pity, only sharpened the way someone's gaze sharpens when they're taking something seriously. So you stopped pretending, she said, and they called it breaking. It wasn't breaking. No, he said, but it was lonely. She said nothing to that. She didn't try to fix it or dismiss it, didn't reach for reassurance or platitude. She just held what he'd said in the space between them, and the holding of it, the simple acknowledgement, did something to Eli that 20 years of solitude had made him forget was possible. He picked up the reins. Come on, we've got a ranch to run. When they got back, Maren changed out of her church dress and went straight to the garden with a shovel. Eli found her 20 minutes later driving the spade into the earth with the kind of force that had nothing to do with gardening. Say it to me, he said, leaning on the fence. I can take it. She looked up, her cheeks flushed with cold and fury. They look at you, a man who served, who bled, who came home carrying things that would have broken most people, and they see a convenient tragedy, something to feel superior to. She stabbed the spade in again. And they look at me and see a woman who had the audacity to make her own decisions, and it terrifies them, because if I can do it, they have to ask themselves why they haven't. She was breathing hard, cheeks blazing, every word landing with the precision of someone who had been composing this argument for a long time and finally had someone worth delivering it to. You're not wrong, Eli said. She blinked. I know I'm not. She leaned on the spade. But it helps to say it. He picked up the other spade. Say the rest. Thomas's family was the same way. She turned back to the earth. After he died, they wanted me in black for 5 years. Wanted me in their house attending their functions, representing their grief on their schedule. She drove the spade deep. They said it was love, but love doesn't require that level of control. What does it require? She was quiet for a moment, the spade still in the earth. I used to think I knew. Thomas and I married young. We were 21. He was my dearest friend, and I loved him truly, but we hadn't had time to become fully real to each other before the war took him. She looked up at the mountains. What I have are the possibilities of what we might have been. All I know for certain is that what his family offered me afterward wasn't love. It was a cage with a prettier name. Eli drove his spade into the frozen earth. They worked in silence for another hour, the mountains enormous and indifferent above them, the work doing what work always does, making the unmanageable slightly more bearable through the simple act of doing something with your hands. It was dusk when they finally went in. Maren made supper, and Eli worked the ranch books at the table beside her, the lamplight making the kitchen feel smaller and warmer than it actually was. They ate without much talking, but the silence had completed its transformation from careful to comfortable, and Eli noticed it the way you notice a headache is gone, not while it's happening, but after, with a quiet gratitude. He was nearly finished eating when Maren set down her fork. I need to tell you something, she said. All right. She reached into the pocket of her dress and set an object on the table between them. A pocket watch, silver-cased, worn smooth on one side from handling. The crystal face was cracked. The hands were stopped at 2:47. I wind it every day, she said. I know it's broken. I know no amount of winding will fix it, but she looked at it. It's the one thing I have that was in his hands when he died. The one thing that was with him at the moment that I wasn't. Eli looked at the watch for a long moment. After Chickamauga, he said slowly, I kept the dog tags of the 3 men I lost. Wore them for a year. Finally took them off because carrying them was starting to feel like punishment instead of memory. He looked at her. There's a difference between keeping a thing because it keeps you connected to someone you loved and keeping it because you're not sure you're allowed to let it go. Maren was very still. Which do you think yours is? He asked. She picked up the watch and held it in her palm, looking at it for a long time. I think, she said finally, That I've been carrying it for both reasons, and I haven't been honest with myself about which one's driving. Eli nodded, said nothing. She closed the watch and put it back in her pocket. Your stew's getting cold, she said. I know. He picked up his fork. It's still good. She smiled at that briefly and went back to eating, and Eli sat across from her in the kitchen where he'd spent 20 winters alone and let himself feel just for a moment the particular warmth of a house that had someone in it. It was the most dangerous thing he'd let himself feel in 2 decades. He was still thinking about it when he went to bed, and he was still thinking about it at 3 a.m. when he heard hoofbeats in the yard and a hard knock at the door that turned his stomach cold before he'd even crossed the room to answer it. He opened the door to find a young man in an expensive traveling suit, his face lean and angular, and set into the expression of a man accustomed to getting what he came for. I'm looking for Maren Ashby, the man said, his Boston accent clipped imprecise. I was told she might be found here. Behind Eli, Maren's voice came from the doorway of the bedroom, low and drained of color. Garrett. The man's eyes moved past Eli as if he wasn't there. Hello, Maren, said Garrett Ashby. Your father-in-law is dying, and we need to discuss what you intend to do about it. The warmth the kitchen had held all evening seemed to go out of the air like a snuffed candle. Eli stood in the doorway of his house and felt with the certainty of a man who had learned to read approaching weather that the 2 weeks he'd been counting on had just become significantly more complicated. Garrett Ashby stepped into the kitchen without being invited, which told Eli everything he needed to know about the man. He was younger than Eli had expected, mid-30s perhaps, with the kind of looks that would have been called handsome if they weren't so carefully arranged. His suit was worth more than Eli's cattle, and he wore it with the ease of someone who had never considered that other people might not have suits that fit that well. He looked around the kitchen with an expression he probably believed was neutral, but was in fact a systematic evaluation of inadequacy. This is where you've been staying, he said to Maren. Not a question. This is where I live, Maren said. She'd come fully into the kitchen now, wrapped in a shawl over her nightgown, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked nothing like the composed woman who'd deflected Mrs. Caldwell's sharpened pleasantries that morning. She looked like someone who'd been pulled out of a nearly safe dream back into something she'd traveled 2,000 miles to avoid. For the moment, Mr. Harding was kind enough to provide accommodation while the teacher's cottage is being prepared. Garrett looked at Eli, then a full look assessing and dismissive in the same motion. I'm Garrett Ashby. My brother was Thomas Ashby. I believe you knew him as my sister-in-law's late husband. I didn't know him, Eli said, but I've heard of him. Yes, Garrett seemed to lose interest in Eli immediately, which suited Eli precisely. Maren, we should speak privately. Whatever you have to say, you can say here. Garrett's jaw moved slightly. Your father-in-law is dying. The doctors give him 6 months, likely less. He's asking for you. Something crossed Maren's face, too complicated to name a mixture of genuine grief and braced wariness. When did Roland fall ill? The diagnosis came in September. We've been looking for you since October. A pause waited with the ghost of reproach. Your departure was rather abrupt. My departure was necessary. Be that as it may. Garrett drew a leather satchel from under his arm and opened it on Eli's kitchen table with the proprietary ease of a man setting up a meeting in his own boardroom. There are significant financial matters that require your attention. Thomas's inheritance, the portion held in trust pending certain conditions, has matured. Along with the estate property on Beacon Hill, the total comes to $60,000. The number sat in the lamplit kitchen like a stone dropped into still water. Maren said nothing. Additionally, Garrett continued, Roland wishes to transfer controlling interest in the family textile operations to you. 3 factories, 512 employees. He feels Thomas would have wanted the business to remain in family hands, and you are technically the only family he trusts with it. What are the conditions? Maren's voice was careful, the wariness fully present now beneath the surface. Simple. You return to Boston within 30 days. You take residence in the Beacon Hill house for a minimum of 2 years, maintaining the family's social obligations. And you agree to serve as chair of the Ashby Charitable Foundation, which requires quarterly presence in Boston for board meetings. Garrett closed the satchel with a soft, satisfied snap. In exchange, you receive financial independence for the rest of your life. Eli watched Maren's face through this recitation. She was keeping it very still, the way a person keeps still when they're listening for the thing that hasn't been said yet. And if I refuse, she asked, the inheritance goes to Roland's discretionary fund. The factories pass to the board of directors who have received several acquisition offers from competing textile interests. The new owners would likely consolidate operations. Garrett met her eyes without discomfort, which means the workforce would be significantly reduced. You're threatening to put 500 families out of work if I don't come home. I'm explaining the consequences of the available choices. The distinction seemed to give him no trouble. I'll need time to think, Maren said. We leave on the afternoon train Friday. That gives you 4 days. Garrett picked up the satchel. I've reserved a room at the Grand Hotel in town. We can meet there Thursday morning to review the formal documents. He glanced around the kitchen one more time. I trust you'll be able to find accommodation more befitting your position once you're home. I'm home now, Maren said quietly enough that Eli wasn't certain Garrett heard it. Garrett pulled on his gloves, nodded to Maren, and walked out without acknowledging Eli's existence, which was the most interesting thing about him. Eli closed the door behind him. In the silence that followed, he could hear the wind picking up outside, rattling the window frames, and Maren's breathing deliberate and controlled, and barely so. Sit down, he said. I'm fine. You're not. Sit down. She sat, and Eli poured the remains of the evening's coffee into her cup and set it in front of her, and then pulled his own chair out and sat across from her the way he'd sat across from her every evening for the past week. Tell me about the factories, he said. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Roland Thomas's father built the business from nothing. 3 mills over 40 years. He's old-fashioned about certain things. He won't modernize beyond what the workers can adapt to. He won't undercut wages to compete with the mills in the South he won't sell. She looked up. He's told me for years that he thought I understood the business the way Thomas would have, that I have the instinct for it. Do you? A complicated pause. Yes, I think I do. And Garrett, something shifted in her face, subtle and telling. Garrett is very good at managing appearances, less good at the actual work. She turned the cup in her hands. Thomas used to say his brother could make any bad idea sound reasonable if he presented it with enough confidence. Eli sat with that for a moment. The foundation he mentioned, the charitable one. The Ashby Foundation has distributed to orphanages, schools, hospitals for 30 years. Roland cares about it deeply. Who runs it now? Garrett manages the finances. Roland sets the direction. She paused. Or he did before he fell ill. And when Roland dies, Maren looked at him with the eyes of a woman who had just arrived at the same question by a slightly longer route. Garrett takes over everything unless I'm there to, she stopped. Unless you are there to provide oversight, Eli finished. She set the cup down. The clock on the mantel ticked 7 times in the silence. Garrett needs me there, she said slowly. Want to honor Thomas's memory. Not even for the factories. She pressed her lips together. If I'm chair of the foundation, I have access to the financial records. Roland trusts me. If something were wrong with the foundation's accounts, a trusted family member asking questions is a problem for someone who doesn't want questions asked. Maren looked at him steadily. Yes. Eli had learned in the war that the simplest explanation for complicated behavior was usually the accurate one. A man didn't come 2,000 miles to retrieve a woman who'd chosen freedom unless he needed her for something. Sentiment was not a sufficient motive for that level of effort. Do you have anything of Thomas's, he asked? Personal papers, letters. His letters from the front. She hesitated. And his journal. He sent it to me before Shiloh said he wanted me to have it in case he didn't come back. She paused. I've never been able to finish reading it. Where is it? She looked at him for a long moment. In my bag. They both looked at the bag by the door, packed and standing where she'd placed it the first morning when she thought he was going to send her away. You should read it, Eli said. I know. Before Thursday. She nodded slowly. Eli stood and picked up both cups and brought them to the basin. He had no idea what was in Thomas Ashby's journal. He had no particular reason to believe it contained anything useful. But he'd spent 20 years making decisions based on incomplete information in difficult conditions, And the habit of gathering every available piece of intelligence before committing to a course of action was so deeply bred into him that it operated without conscious thought. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow will, he stopped. Tomorrow will, like there was a we. Tomorrow I'll work the north fence, he amended. You should get some rest. Maren looked at him with those eyes that cataloged everything. Eli, he stopped. Thank you. She held his gaze. Not for the housing, for tonight, for... She gestured slightly a small motion that seemed to encompass the coffee and the sitting across from her and the listening and the question about the factories. For treating it like a problem that could be thought through. It can be. I know that now. She looked down. The Whitmores, Garrett and Roland, they don't present problems that way. They present them as fait accompli, as things that are already decided and you're simply being informed. She looked up. You asked me what the factories were and what the foundation was and whether I'd read the journal. Nobody's asked me those questions. They're obvious questions. Obvious to someone who thinks I'm capable of doing something with the answers. Eli had nothing to say to that. He recognized the anger in it, the particular anger of competence that has been persistently underestimated, and he found it clarifying rather than uncomfortable. Read the journal, he said, then we'll talk. Go ahead. She read it that night and most of the next day. Eli was aware of it without watching for it, a kind of low-level attention in him that tracked where she was and whether she'd eaten and whether the sound of pages turning from the kitchen was still happening. He worked the ranch, checked the herd, tightened the hardware on the barn doors, did everything a man does when he's trying not to think about something by keeping his hands occupied. At dusk, she found him at the water trough refilling it from the hand pump. He knew, she said. Eli looked at her face. Whatever she'd found in the journal had stripped away several layers of her composure and left something rawer and harder underneath. Garrett was embezzling from the foundation, she said. Thomas figured it out 2 months before Shiloh. He wrote it all down, dates, amounts, the account transfers. He wrote that he was going to confront Garrett when he came home. She paused. He wrote that if something happened to him, I should look at the foundation accounts for the year 1862 and ask Garrett to explain the March disbursements. Eli put the pump handle down. How much? Thomas estimated $12,000 over 18 months. That was before he died. If Garrett's continued over 2 years, potentially much more. She gripped the journal against her chest. Roland is dying. He trusts Garrett completely. If I'm chair of the foundation with access to the accounts, Garrett has to stop. Or explain himself. She looked at Eli with eyes that were furious and terrified and entirely decided. That's why he came. That's why he made it about the workers and Roland's final wish and $60,000 and everything else. He needs me in Boston under control, signing documents he's already prepared. Because as long as I'm here, I'm outside his reach. And if I go back on his terms, his house, his schedule, his foundation board, he controls what I see and what I can ask. The journal, Eli said, it's evidence. Of what Thomas suspected 2 years ago, yes. But I'd need access to the current accounts to prove what's actually happened since. She pressed her lips together. Which means I'd need to be in a position of authority in the foundation. Eli was quiet for a moment. A thin-legged bird had landed on the fence post at the corner of the yard and was watching them with the bright, officious attention of a bird that had no idea it was interrupting a serious conversation. There's a territorial judge comes through Sweetwater Basin in March. Yesham, he said. Name of Kramer. He's from the Eastern Bar, practiced in New York before he came west. He'd know what to do with financial fraud evidence. Maren stared at him. How do you know that? I know everyone who passes through this territory. When you live alone long enough, knowing things about people is how you stay safe. He looked at the bird on the fence post. You don't need to go back to Boston to get justice for what Garrett's doing. You need documentation and a judge who can read financial records. I'd still need access to the foundation's accounts. Does Roland know how to reach you? Yes, I wrote to him when I arrived. I told him I was well and had found a position. A pause. He's always been kind to me. Then write to him, not about Garrett, not yet. Ask him to send you a copy of the foundation's annual reports for the past 2 years. Tell him you're considering the board position and want to review the financials before making your decision. Eli turned back toward the barn. A dying man who trusts you will send you what you ask for. He won't see anything wrong with it, and Garrett won't know what you're doing until you already have what you need. Maren stood in the cooling dusk, the journal pressed to her chest, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. You think like a general, she said. I think like a sergeant, he said. Generals make the plan. Sergeants figure out how to make it work with what's actually available. She was quiet for a moment, then, will you help me write the letter? After supper, he said, the cattle don't feed themselves, or sheets. They wrote the letter to Maren Ashby that evening, careful and deliberate, Maren dictating and Eli asking questions when the phrasing felt slanted or when the logic had a gap. She was, he discovered, exceptionally precise when she wasn't frightened. She had a mind that organized information naturally, that identified the relevant detail, without prompting, that understood the difference between what to say and what to leave out. He also discovered over the course of the evening that he was beginning to understand her particular silences. The one that meant she was thinking. The one that meant she'd decided something. The one that meant she was deciding whether to say something and had not yet decided. He was in the middle of noticing this when he realized what he was doing. He was paying attention to another person, the way he'd sworn to stop paying attention to people. The way that led to things mattering. The way that led to having something to lose. He sealed the letter and said goodnight and went to the bedroom before he could examine the feeling further. Thursday arrived faster than he wanted. They rode to the Grand Hotel in the wagon, Maren straight-backed and composed in her dark blue dress, the journal wrapped in cloth and tucked into her bag. Eli kept his eyes on the road and his thoughts off the fact that in 48 hours, Garrett Ashby would be on a train back to Boston one way or another. The private dining room at the Grand Hotel had been set up like a negotiation, which was what it was. Garrett sat at the head of the polished table with two men in expensive suits, a lawyer named Dunmore, and a financial advisor named Rand, and the formal inheritance documents laid out in a precise fan across the surface. Right on time, Garrett said, with the warmth of a man who'd expected to have to wait. His eyes moved to Eli with visible effort, as if acknowledging him cost something. I wasn't expecting... He stays, Maren said, sitting down. Or I leave. Garrett's jaw tightened by a fraction. Of course, he turned to the lawyers. Gentlemen, this is my late brother's wife, Maren Ashby, my sister-in-law, and her... He paused with the precision of someone choosing a word. Acquaintance. Partner, Maren said pleasantly, in the ranch. Dunmore and Rand exchanged a glance that Eli filed away. Garrett walked Maren through the documents, and Eli listened with the attention of a man accustomed to detecting what wasn't being said. There were three documents, the inheritance transfer, the property deed, and the foundation charter amendment that would install Maren as chair. The last one required her signature within 30 days of the date and included language that gave the board, currently composed of Garrett and two associates he'd selected, authority over foundation disbursements, with the chair's role confined to strategic direction and public representation, which meant Maren would be the face. Garrett would keep the money. Eli watched Maren read through the charter amendment twice. She didn't look up or pause. Her expression gave nothing away. But when she set it down, she set it slightly farther from herself than the other documents, and Eli noted this. I have a question about the foundation accounts, Maren said. Specifically the operating expenditures for the past 2 fiscal years. I'd like to review them before signing anything. Rand cleared his throat. That would typically be provided upon assuming the chair position. That's not how I operate. Maren looked at Garrett directly. Roland asked me to be chair because he trusts me. I take that trust seriously, which means I need to understand what I'm being trusted with before I commit to anything. Garrett's expression was very still. I'm sure we can arrange to have the records sent once you've... I'd like them now or on Friday before the train. If that's not possible, I'm afraid I'll need more time before I can sign. Dunmore and Rand both looked at Garrett, who was doing something complicated and controlled behind his face. I'll see what can be arranged, he said. I appreciate that. Maren folded her hands on the table. I do want to be clear about something, Garrett. She looked at him with the steadiness that Eli had first noticed in his kitchen, the steadiness of a woman who had decided not to be afraid. I love Thomas. I grieve him still, and I'm genuinely sorry about Roland. But I came to Wyoming because this is where I want to build my life, and that hasn't changed. Whatever decision I make about Boston, I'll make it for my own reasons." Garrett looked at her. "And what reasons are those?" "Mine," she said. They left the Grand Hotel with nothing signed and nothing promised. Walking down the hotel steps into the October sun, Maren took one deep breath and let it out slowly, and Eli saw the shaking in her hands that she'd kept successfully hidden for the past hour. "You did well," he said. "I feel like I swallowed a stone." "That means you're still in the fight." He helped her up to the wagon seat. "He didn't give you the accounts." "He won't, not voluntarily." She looked at the hotel facade. "But he knows I asked, which means he knows I suspect something, which means he might do something rash before Friday." Maren was quiet for a moment. "Like what?" Eli picked up the reins. "I don't know yet, but we should be ready for it." He turned the wagon toward the road home. "Write to Roland tonight. Send the letter before Garrett can think of a reason to intercept it." She nodded, and then after a moment in a voice that was nearly too quiet to hear over the wagon wheels, "I don't want to go back to Boston." "I know," Eli said, "even for the right reasons." "I know." She looked at him sidelong. "Is that a problem?" He kept his eyes on the road. "Depends what you choose," he said, "and why." They rode home through the late afternoon light, and the mountains threw their shadows long across the valley. And in the kitchen that night, Maren wrote 2 letters, one to Maren Ashby, one to a clerk at the First National Bank of Boston, who'd been a loyal friend of Thomas's, and who might she thought have access to records that Garrett believed were safely out of reach. Eli sat at the table and watched her write and told himself it was only practical to stay close in case she needed to talk through the wording. He almost believed it. Outside, the Wyoming wind picked up and pressed against the window glass, and somewhere on the north pasture, one of the cattle lowed into the darkness, and the house held its warmth against the cold, and the lamplight sat steady and sure in the window. 2 plates on the table, cleared now and waiting for morning. Friday came, and the train left Sweetwater Basin at 3 in the afternoon, and Garrett Ashby was on it. Eli found out from Holt, who stopped by the ranch that evening, looking vaguely sheepish and more than vaguely confused. "He just left," the sheriff said, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands. "Didn't say anything to anyone. Just him and those 2 lawyers, 4 trunks, and a hired hand to manage the luggage." "He get what he came for?" Eli asked. "Not that I could tell." Holt glanced toward the kitchen window where the lamp was burning, and Maren was visible at the table. "Miss Ashby all right?" "Mrs. Ashby," Eli said. "And she's fine." After Holt rode away, Eli stood in the yard for a while in the cold. The train going east meant Garrett was temporarily gone, not permanently. There was a difference. A man who'd come 2,000 miles once would come again if the first trip failed, especially if the stakes were as high as Eli now suspected they were. He went inside. Maren looked up from a book, the journal again, or perhaps a letter. He wasn't close enough to see and read his face. "He left," she said, "this morning." She closed the book, without the signatures. Without them. She sat with that for a moment. "Then Roland's letter will arrive in Boston in about 10 days. Garrett will know I wrote to ask for the accounts." She turned the book over in her hands. "He'll come back." "Probably," Eli agreed, "but not for a few weeks. Winter travel is hard." He sat down across from her. "We have time." "For what?" "For whatever you decide to do." He held her gaze. "Have you decided?" Maren set the book on the table. She looked at it, then at him, then at the window where the darkness pressed. "I wake up every morning here, she said slowly, "and for the first hour before I've thought about Boston or Garrett or Roland, I feel something I'd forgotten I was capable of feeling." She paused. "I feel like whatever happens today will happen because I chose it, not because someone arranged it." She looked at him. "I haven't felt that since Thomas left for the front." "That's an answer," Eli said. "That's the feeling. It's not the same as an answer." She pressed her lips together. "I can't ignore 500 families losing their livelihoods because I want to grow a garden in Wyoming. If Garrett is stealing from the foundation, those families are already at risk, whether you go back to Boston or not." She stopped. He watched the thought move across her face. "You're right," she said finally. "If he's been embezzling and Roland dies, then someone needs to expose it. Doesn't have to be you in a Boston parlor." He leaned forward. "It has to be you with evidence and a judge who knows what to do with it." She looked at him for a long moment. You make it sound like I can fight Garrett from Wyoming. You wrote 2 letters last night that Garrett has no idea exist. From where I'm sitting, you already are. The look on her face when he said it, something between startled and grateful, and something else he didn't have a name for, was the kind of look that made 20 years of careful solitude feel like something he'd chosen instead of something he'd been stuck with. 2 weeks, she said. He looked at her. You said 2 weeks and then I'd leave. She was watching him carefully. It's been 11 days. I know. 3 more days. I know that too. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The fence on the south quarter still needs work, he said. And the barn roof has a section that won't hold through a serious snow. And the cattle need a second head count before winter set. Eli, he stopped. Are you asking me to stay? She asked. He was quiet for a moment that lasted about 3 seconds longer than a man who didn't care would have needed. The 2 weeks was always a fool's number, he said. I knew that at 10 days. When did you know it? About the time you laughed at the garden, and I realized I'd been waiting 20 years for someone to make that sound in this yard. He said it evenly without drama. I'm not good at asking for things. I've made do without for long enough that the habit's deep. Maren looked at him with those steady cataloging eyes. You're asking now. I'm pointing out that the roof needs work and the cattle need counting, and I could use a partner who knows how to read financial documents and doesn't flinch at rifle barrels. He held her gaze. If that's what you want. She was quiet for 3 full seconds. 25% of the profits, she said at 20. Half the work. You're still learning. I'll learn faster than you expect. You always do. He said it so simply that she blinked. 25%. Deal. She stuck out her hand across the table. He took it. Her grip was firm and sure, and her hand was cold from the autumn night, and they shook, and the 2 weeks became permanent without anyone saying so explicitly. The school board met on Monday. Sheriff Holt came to the ranch Tuesday morning with his hat in his hands again, and the look of a man delivering news he'd rather not be responsible for. Maren read it in his face before he said a word and went very still in the kitchen doorway. They voted to terminate your contract, Holt said. He had the grace to look genuinely troubled. I'm sorry, Mrs. Ashby. I argued against it. They voted 4-1. On what grounds? Maren's voice was controlled. Conduct unbecoming. Mrs. Caldwell presented a petition signed by 7 families. Reverend Price seconded the motion. Holt's jaw worked. They said a teacher living in an unmarried arrangement couldn't model the values they wanted their children taught. Maren said nothing for a moment. Then, you said 4-1. Who voted against Henderson's wife? She has 2 daughters who can't afford the year without schooling, and she said so to Mrs. Caldwell's face. Holt paused. It didn't change the count. After Holt left, Maren stood in the kitchen looking at the floor. Eli waited. I turned down $60,000, she said finally, her voice still entirely controlled. Stayed in this territory, committed to building something here, and they took the one thing I came here to do. Yes, Eli said. They did it to punish me for staying. Yes, she looked up. Her eyes were bright with fury, not tears. What a remarkable coincidence that the same people who wanted me gone found a legitimate reason to make it difficult for me to remain. Not a coincidence. No. She straightened her spine. I need to be outside. She went to the garden. Eli watched her from the window for 10 minutes, then went to the barn and saddled his horse and rode to Walt Greer's property. Walt listened to the situation from the seat of his porch rocker, chewing on a pipe stem that had been unlit for years. He was 70 and weathered and had the particular patience of a man who had watched many emergencies resolve themselves into inconveniences. Caldwell and Matthews, he said when Eli finished. Miller's people. Eli stopped. Miller. Harlan Voss has had his eye on your north pasture since the drought 2 years ago. Walt knocked the pipe bowl against his palm. Creek runs through your property before it hits his. He's been in town talking to Caldwell and Dawson and Price for a month. Friendly dinners, church donations. The old man looked at him steadily. You brought a woman into this territory who turned down family money to stay, which means she's committed. And you're working together, which means your spread's going to get stronger. That's a problem for a man who wanted your creek access and was counting on you to sell eventually. Eli looked at the mountains. Getting the school teacher fired. Walt continued, is step one. Next comes the water. Eli rode home in the late afternoon and found Maren in the kitchen, the sleeves of her work dress rolled to the elbows, making bread with a violence that was frankly impressive. Walt Greer thinks Voss is behind the school board vote, he said. Maren's hands stilled in the dough. Harlan Voss, Eli said. He runs the largest operation in the basin, 1,200 head good land, but his creek access is downstream from ours, and with the water running low this year. He wants your property, Maren said. Our property, Eli said, because they'd shaken on it 3 days ago, and he was not going to go back on it now. Maren turned the bread dough out onto the board. What's his play? Pressure. Make the ranch untenable. Make the territory hostile enough that I sell, and he buys the creek access with the land. He sat down. Or now that you're here, make it hostile enough that you leave and I go back to struggling alone. He doesn't know me very well. No, Eli agreed. He doesn't. Maren shaped the loaves with quick, precise movements. What do? First, we understand what we're dealing with. He pulled his chair around to face her across the work table. Walt says Voss has been buying people in this town for a month. That means whatever he's planning is organized, not impulsive. He's going to do this methodically. So we do the same. We build allies. Walt's on our side. He's been waiting for someone to push back against Voss for years. Widow LaRue to the east has a smaller operation, good sense, and no patience for Voss's methods. There are 2 or 3 smaller ranchers who've been squeezed before. We build a coalition. For the first move comes. Maren looked at him. You think the first move is already coming? I think Harlan Voss did not spend a month buying influence in this town just to fire a school teacher. The first move came 6 days later. Eli had ridden to the eastern fence at dawn to check the pasture rotation. When he came back in the early afternoon, Maren was standing by the barn with the expression of a woman who was controlling her reaction very deliberately. 20 feet of fence line had been cut. Clean, methodical cuts wire clippers, not wine damage. 14 of their cattle were gone. I counted as many as I could before they scattered into the tree line, Maren said. Happened sometime between first light and now. Eli examined the cut wire. The cuts were spaced at intervals carefully done. Someone who knew how to take a fence apart without making it look like accident. Voss, Maren said. You can't prove I know. She looked at him steadily. What do? We track what we can. We repair what we have. We don't show him we're rattled. Eli stood and looked at the cut line. And we start thinking about evidence. They spent 2 days tracking the scattered cattle. By the end, they had recovered 11 of the 14. 3 were gone, almost certainly absorbed into Voss's herd, and already rebranded. The financial loss was real. The message was worse. Voss could reach them, could take things. And so far, there was nothing to show for it but 3 missing cattle and a repaired fence. The next week, Eli rode out to Walt Greer's property again. This time he brought a plan. Walt's barn had become the informal meeting place of their coalition. Walt himself, Widow LaRue, and her eldest son and 2 younger ranchers named Perkins and Drake, who'd both had run-ins with Voss's operations in the past. Maren came too, which some of them hadn't expected, and all of them seemed to respect once she started talking. We need evidence, she said, standing at the end of Walt's grain table, her map of the basin spread out between them. Not complaints, not witness accounts that can be attributed to self-interest. Physical evidence documented with witnesses who can't be dismissed as having a stake in the outcome. What kind of physical evidence? Perkins asked. He was young, barely 25, and had the wariness of someone who'd lost a fight recently. Photographic. Maren looked at Eli. You said there's a photographer in town. Jeb Carver. He came west from Chicago 3 years ago. Does portraits and commission work. Could he be trusted? He's got no connection to Voss that I know of. Maren turned back to the map. Voss's men come at night or early morning. We know that from the fence cutting, it happened while Eli was on the east pasture and before I came out. They're disciplined. They don't make mistakes. She pointed to the north boundary, which means they're predictable. They'll hit the same places in the same patterns until we change the pattern. She looked around the table. So we changed the pattern. We set up the watch here. She pointed to a ridge above Voss's north pasture, and here. 6 witnesses, and we borrow Mr. Carver's camera. There was a silence. A photograph of Voss's men on LaRue's property stealing her cattle with 6 witnesses, Walt said slowly. That's a rustling charge. With photographic evidence, Maren said, that's a hanging offense in this territory, Drake said, sounding slightly stunned. Not if they don't ride for Voss, Maren said, which is how Voss will play it. So we need the photograph to show the brands on their horses, and we need the witnesses to make the connection irrefutable. She looked at Eli. Can Carver make a nighttime photograph work? He'll need a flash powder charge. It'll light up like a signal fire. Good. Her eyes were steady. Let them know they've been seen. They waited 2 weeks. It was 16 days, in fact, of cold nights and near misses and 2 false starts and 1 incident where Perkins fell asleep on watch at the worst possible moment, and they nearly missed the opportunity entirely. Maren took the coldest watches without complaint, 2 to 5 in the morning, bundled in Eli's heaviest coat, crouched on the ridge above Widow LaRue's east pasture with Walt Greer's old field glasses and a composure that Eli, watching her from 20 yards away, found almost frightening in its steadiness. On the 16th night, Voss's men came. There were 4 of them riding out of the dark with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this before. They moved LaRue's cattle in a practiced sweep, driving them east toward the tree line. The 6 witnesses moved into position. Eli signaled Carver, who was crouched in the brush with the camera mounted on his tripod, the powder charge prepared. The flash lit the hillside like a lightning strike. The 4 riders froze their faces, turned toward the light, caught fully visible, their horses' brands clear in the sudden illumination. And Maren stepped out from behind the ridge, not with a gun, but with Thomas Ashby's pocket watch held up in the light from the dying powder flash, and her voice rang out across the hillside in the profound silence that followed. I know who sent you, she said clearly, and now everyone here does too. They brought the photographs and the signed witness statements to Sheriff Holt the next morning. The photographs were crisp. Carver, it turned out, was exceptionally good at his work and showed the 4 riders with their faces turned toward the camera, the Widow LaRue's cattle being driven before them, and the brands on their horses clearly visible. Holt looked at the photographs for a long time. His face went through several things. Those are Voss's men, he said. 3 of them, yes, Eli said. The 4th works for Voss on a casual basis. Holt set the photographs down. He looked at the 6 signed statements. He looked at Eli, then at Maren. This is a serious charge, he said. It's cattle rustling, Maren said. Committed on Widow LaRue's property, witnessed by 6 people photographed. Yes, it's serious. Holt stared at the photographs for another long moment. I'll need to bring them in for questioning, he paused. And Voss. Voss gave the order, Eli said. The evidence implicates the men. To get to Voss, I'll need them to... They'll talk, Maren said. When it's a choice between a hanging charge and pointing at the man who paid them, men talk. Holt picked up the photographs again carefully as if they might change under examination. Then he stood and put on his hat. Wait here, he said. Harlan Voss arrived at the sheriff's office in Sweetwater Basin at 2 in the afternoon, accompanied by his lawyer and a personal confidence that had carried him through 20 years of being the most powerful man in the basin. He walked through the door with the expression of a man attending a nuisance meeting, not alarmed, not particularly concerned. He stopped when he saw the photographs laid out on Holt's desk. Eli watched the confidence change. Not collapse men like Voss didn't collapse easily, but recalibrate, reassess, finding the angle. Those are my employees, Voss said, who I was unaware had been freelancing on their own time. I can assure you I had no knowledge. And save it, Holt said. The sheriff had a flatness in his voice that Eli hadn't heard from him before. One of those men rode for you exclusive for 3 years and has no work history anywhere else. The brands on his horse match your remuda. And all 4 of them, when I brought them in this morning, said the same thing within 30 seconds of each other, that they were acting on their employer's instructions. Voss looked at Holt for a moment. Then he looked at Maren. He had the kind of stare that was meant to make people feel small. Maren held it without moving. You've been here, 6 weeks, Voss said to her. Long enough, she said. You think you understand how this basin works, what it takes to survive a Wyoming winter, what I've built here over 20 years. I understand that you've used what you built to steal from people who couldn't fight back. She held his gaze. And I understand that you made the mistake of assuming I was the same as them. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not respect, not quite, but a recalibration of the risk she represented. This isn't over, he said. It's over, Eli said. For today. Holt arrested Voss's men on the spot. He held Voss for questioning, and at the end of 2 hours released him. Not enough direct evidence to hold him, but the men had talked, and what they'd said was being written down by Holt's deputy in a careful hand, and Voss knew it. He rode out of Sweetwater Basin that afternoon without looking back. Walt Greer was waiting outside the sheriff's office when they emerged. He looked at them both, then at the building behind them, then back. Well, he said. Well, Eli agreed. I'll be damned, said Walt, and went to find his horse. That night, Maren and Eli sat on the porch in the cold because neither of them could stay inside. The sky was enormous and frostbright, and the basin lay dark and quiet around them. It won't hold, Maren said. No, Eli agreed. Voss won't stop. He'll be more careful, but he won't stop. And Garrett will come back. Probably. She was quiet for a moment, wrapped in the heavy coat, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. When I was in Boston, she said, after Thomas died, I used to sit in the drawing room at night and think about what courage actually was, because everyone kept telling me I was brave, brave to carry on, brave to manage my grief with dignity. And I kept thinking that it wasn't courage. It was just going through the motions because the alternative was stopping. She looked at the stars. This is different. This is actually frightening. Yes, Eli said, and I'd do it again. I know. She turned to look at him. I should tell you something. All right. I stopped counting the days. She met his gaze steadily. The 2-week arrangement. I stopped counting a while ago. The cold pressed down around them. Inside the house, the banked fire breathed. I know, Eli said. When did you stop? He looked at the dark mountains. About the time you took the cold watch without being asked. She turned back to the stars. After a long moment, she said, what happens next? Garrett comes back. The accounts from Roland arrive or they don't. Voss tries something else or he doesn't. He paused. We handle it. Together. That's what partners do. The frost settled on the grass in the yard, silver and still. Somewhere in the darkness of the north pasture, one of the cattle moved, and the sound of it was the particular sound of a living thing in its right place. Maren closed her hand around the pocket watch in her coat pocket. She didn't take it out. Eli, she said. Yes. Thank you. A pause. For all of it. He didn't answer because there wasn't anything to say that the silence didn't say better. He just stayed where he was on the porch beside her in the cold Wyoming night and let it be enough. Roland Ashby's letter arrived on a Thursday, brought by the postwriter who came through Sweetwater Basin twice a week and who handed Maren the envelope with the particular care of someone delivering something important. She read it at the kitchen table while Eli was finishing his coffee. He watched her face. It was a short letter. Roland Ashby was apparently a man who said what needed saying without elaborate decoration. Maren set it on the table and then looked at the wall for a moment. He's enclosed a letter of authorization, she said, to his bank, allowing me access to the foundation account records through the end of 1883. He didn't ask why you wanted them. He wrote that he'd been worried for 2 years about the March 1862 disbursements. Maren's voice was very controlled. He wrote that Thomas must have told me. Eli set his cup down. He suspected Garrett, she said. He suspected him and he couldn't prove it, and he was too sick to fight it, and Thomas was dead. She looked at the letter. He wrote that he needed someone he could trust to look, and that he was sorry he didn't ask sooner. The kitchen was very quiet. He needs to know, Eli said. I know. She folded the letter carefully and set it on top of the journal. I'll write to him today, but I need the account records first. How do we get them? Maren looked at the bank authorization in her hand. The First National in Cheyenne has a branch relationship with Roland's Boston Bank. With this letter, I can request a copy of the foundation accounts through their wire service. She looked up. It'll take a week, maybe less. Garrett will know when the request goes through. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. He'll come back when he does. Then we move fast. Maren rode to Cheyenne with the letter the following day, a 14-hour round trip that she made without complaint, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, with confirmation that the wire request had been processed and the account records would arrive within 5 business days. In the meantime, Voss moved. It was Walt Greer's boy who came to the ranch at dusk on the second day after Maren returned from Cheyenne, a 12-year-old named Cody, riding hard and scared with a message from his father. Walt had been on the road between his property and town when two riders came out of the tree line and ran his wagon off the track. He'd been cut across the ribs with a fence blade, not deep enough to be immediately fatal, but serious enough to make a point. Eli brought Walt back to the ranch because the nearest doctor was in Cheyenne, and Walt refused to make the trip. Maren cleaned and stitched the wound in the kitchen with the same calm efficiency she'd shown the first time Eli came home, bleeding from barbed wire, and Walt sat through it without making a sound, which said something about the constitution of old Wyoming ranchers. They told him to reconsider his vote, Maren said afterward, washing her hands in the basin. Yes, Eli said. They didn't come after us. No, she turned to face him. Why not? Eli thought about it. Because coming after us directly risks the photographs getting to the territorial court with an assault charge attached. Voss is already on thin ice with Holt. But going after Walt, he paused. Walt's our coalition. If Walt recants, if Perkins and Drake lose their nerve, the witness statements go soft. Maren dried her hands. He's cutting the legs out from under the evidence. Methodically, Eli looked at her. We need to get those account records and move on Garrett before Voss's pressure erodes the coalition entirely. Or we need to give the coalition a reason to hold. Maren crossed her arms. What does Voss actually want? The creek, the land. If he can't intimidate us into selling and he can't touch us directly because of the photographs, what's his next move? Eli sat down. He ties us up in legal disputes, claims on water rights, boundary challenges, livestock registration complaints. Nothing that can win outright, but everything that costs money and time and makes running the ranch unsustainable. How much money do we have? The directness of it, we startled him even now. Enough for a hard winter, not much for lawyers. Maren was quiet for a moment. The $60,000, she said. Don't. Listen, if the account records show what I think they show, if Garrett has been systematically taking from the foundation, then what he's stolen is technically part of Thomas's estate, part of what Roland intended to leave to me. She met his eyes. There's a legal argument that I'm owed restitution, which means there's potentially money to fight this that has nothing to do with going back to Boston. Eli looked at her. You'd have to go to court. Yes. Territorial court, the judge who comes through in March. Judge Kramer, she said, whom you mentioned 2 months ago. He sat back. You've been thinking about this since October. I've been thinking about everything since October. She sat down across from him. I know it's not certain. I know Garrett will fight it, and Roland might not live to see it resolved, and the territorial legal system has its own complicated relationship with women asserting property rights. She looked at him steadily. But I'm not going back to Boston on Garrett's terms, and I'm not going to let Voss squeeze us out. And I'm not willing to let Roland die thinking he failed to protect what Thomas worked for. Eli looked at this woman who'd been in his house for 8 weeks, who'd tended his mother's garden and taken cold night watches and walked into the Grand Hotel and refused to be afraid and stitched Walt Greer's ribs with steady hands, who'd written strategic letters to dying fathers-in-law and requested bank records through wire services and built a coalition of ranchers out of shared grievance and clear-eyed pragmatism, who had set 2 plates on his table and waited for him to come home and hadn't been afraid of his rifle or his silence or his 20 years of careful absence. The account records arrived this week, he said. Yes. When they do, we know what we're dealing with. Yes. And Garrett comes back when the bank request hits his awareness. Probably within 10 days, 2 weeks at most. Eli looked at the table, at the journal lying there and the letter from Roland and the authorization form, and the cup he'd been drinking his coffee from when all of this started. We need Holt, he said. Holt's been sitting with us since the photographs. He voted against the school board dismissal. Not Holt for the water dispute. Holt is a witness when the account records arrive and Garrett shows up. He looked at her. If Garrett comes to retrieve those records, and he will, or he'll try to challenge their legal status, we need law present. You think he'll try to take them? I think a man who's been embezzling for 2 years and has a dying father and a coalition forming against him is a man who's running out of options. Running out of options makes people do things that are obvious in retrospect. Maren looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding whether to say something. "What?" he asked. "You'd have made a very good lawyer," she said. "I'd have made a terrible lawyer. I don't have the patience for the argument." He stood. "I have the patience for the preparation." The account records arrived on a Wednesday. They came through the Cheyenne branch, delivered by the postwriter in a sealed envelope addressed to Maren Ashby with the First National Bank of Cheyenne's stamp on the outer seal. She opened them at the kitchen table with Eli beside her, and Walt recovered enough to sit upright and ride slowly, though Maren had extracted a promise that he'd rest for the week watching from the chair by the fire. Maren worked through the ledgers with a focused quiet that reminded Eli of the way experienced scouts read terrain. She started at the beginning, moved methodically through months and years, marking entries with a pencil at her elbow. An hour passed, then another. Walt fell asleep in the chair. Eli sat at the other end of the table and did not interrupt. When Maren finally set her pencil down, her face was very still. "How much?" Eli asked. "Over 3 years." She looked at the pages. $41,000. The number sat between them. "Routed through 3 different accounts," she continued. 2 in Boston, 1 in New York. The disbursements are labeled as legitimate foundation expenses, building repairs, material donations, administrative costs. But the vendors don't exist. I checked 3 of them against the business registrations Thomas mentioned in his journal. They're shells. Shell companies Garrett controls. Yes. She looked up. Roland has been funding his son's personal account for 3 years, thinking he was running a charity. Walt made a sound from the chair. They both looked at him. "Sorry," the old man said. "Wasn't entirely asleep." He looked at Maren. "That's fraud. Federal fraud if the mail was involved." "The transactions were wired," Maren said, "which means telegraphic fraud statutes." She paused. "Which is federal jurisdiction." Eli looked at the accounts spread across his kitchen table. "Kramer," he said. "Judge Kramer," Maren agreed. "And Kramer was Eastern Bar, which means he knows financial fraud." "Yes." She gathered the pages, carefully aligning them precisely. "Garrett is going to arrive here within 2 weeks, expecting to retrieve these records or invalidate them. When he does, I want to be ready." "What does ready look like?" "Copies of everything certified through Holt's office. The originals secured somewhere Garrett can't reach them." She looked at the journal beside the accounts. Thomas's journal as corroborating evidence that the suspicion was documented before the fraud continued. She paused. "And Garrett on record, preferably with witnesses trying to suppress evidence, because that adds obstruction to the fraud." Walt shifted in the chair. "You're setting a trap." "I'm providing an opportunity," Maren said, "for Garrett to make the same mistake he's been making for 3 years, assuming I don't understand what I'm looking at." Garrett arrived on a Saturday, 12 days after the wire request had been processed. He came on the afternoon stage from Cheyenne, which meant someone in the Cheyenne banking office had telegraphed him money could buy information quickly enough when the stakes were high. He went to the Grand Hotel first, and then he came to the ranch with Dunmore, the lawyer, and a new man Eli hadn't seen before, younger, harder looking, with the kind of stillness that usually meant professional intimidation. Eli opened the door. The 3 men stood in the yard. "I need to speak with Maren," Garrett said. "Come in," Eli said. The invitation seemed to surprise Garrett, which was the intent. Sheriff Holt was already in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his coffee and his badge visible on his vest, and the particular expression of official neutrality he'd developed for uncomfortable occasions. Maren sat across from him with the account records stacked neatly in front of her and Thomas's journal beside them, and her hands folded on the table. Garrett walked in, saw Holt, and stopped. "Sheriff," he said carefully. "Mr. Ashby," Holt said. "Just having coffee. Miss Ashby invited me to stop by. Beautiful morning for it." Garrett's eyes moved to the accounts on the table. Something happened in his face. The practiced composure cracked at the seams for a fraction of a second, then reassembled. "Maren," he said, "I understand you have been reviewing foundation documents." "I have." Her voice was pleasant, even warm. "Please sit down, Garrett. I think we should talk about the March 1862 disbursements." The silence that followed was very long. Dunmore put his hand on Garrett's arm. A lawyer's gesture stopped talking, but Garrett brushed it off. He was looking at Maren with the expression of a man who has spent his life winning arguments, and is encountering for the first time the possibility that the argument was already over before it started. Those records are the Foundation's confidential financial documents, he said. You had no authority. I had Roland's written authorization. Maren slid the letter across the table, which he provided because he's been concerned about certain discrepancies for some time. Discrepancies that Thomas documented in his journal. She set the journal beside the authorization, which Thomas sent me before Shiloh in case he didn't come home, and which I've now had reviewed by a legal clerk in Cheyenne who specializes in financial instrument fraud. Garrett looked at the journal. His face had gone the particular gray of a man standing at the edge of something he can't step back from. Garrett. Her voice changed then, not cold, not satisfied, but something older and more complicated. Roland is dying. He trusted you. He built something over 40 years and believed he was leaving it in your hands. She held his gaze. Thomas knew. He knew, and he was going to come home and confront you and give you the chance to make it right. And then he died, and you took that as an opportunity to continue. She paused. I am giving you the choice Thomas intended to give you. You can return what you've taken, cooperate with the accounting, and allow Roland to die knowing the Foundation is intact. Or I take this to Judge Kramer in March and you face federal charges. Dunmore was very still. The hard-looking young man by the door had the expression of someone reassessing what kind of job he'd been hired for. Garrett looked at his lawyer, then at Holt, then at Eli, who was standing by the wall with his arms crossed and no particular expression, which was a thing Eli had learned in the war was more useful than any expression. You have no idea, Garrett said quietly to Maren, what it costs to maintain what we have. What I've had to do to keep the family's position while Roland refused to modernize, refused to cut costs, refused to... None of that is a justification, Maren said. And you know it. It's context. It's an explanation for why you did it. It's not an excuse. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to justify it. I'm asking you to choose what happens next. Garrett sat for a long time in the silence of Eli Harding's kitchen in Sweetwater Basin, Wyoming, with a sheriff drinking coffee nearby and a lawyer who'd stopped touching his arm because the argument was indeed already over. What are the terms, he said finally. Full accounting of every unauthorized disbursement. Restitution plan presented to Roland's physician and his personal attorney, not Dunmore, someone Roland chose himself, within 30 days. Cooperation with an independent audit of the Foundation's accounts going forward. She paused. In exchange, I will not take this to federal court, provided the restitution is completed within 18 months and the Foundation is transferred to an independent trustee before Roland dies. And you, I will serve as Roland's trustee, not Garrett's, Roland's. She met his eyes, the way Thomas wanted. Garrett looked at the accounts, at the journal, at his hands on the table. I'll need to speak with my attorney, he said. Of course. Maren stood. You can use the sitting room. Take whatever time you need. She walked past Garrett and past Dunmore and past the hard young man by the door and out of the kitchen. Eli followed her into the yard. They stood by the fence in the late afternoon light. Maren's hands were shaking finely, barely visible, and she pressed them flat against the fence rail until they stopped. You were extraordinary, Eli said. I was terrified. Yes, he looked at her. You were extraordinary anyway. She turned and looked up at him with those dark eyes that had walked into his house 10 weeks ago and started dismantling 20 years of careful silence. The sun was behind her, catching the loose strands of her hair, and the mountains were enormous against the sky. And Eli Harding, who had spent 20 years making sure nothing mattered enough to hurt him, felt the particular irrevocable sensation of a wall coming down. I'm not going back to Boston, she said. Not on Garrett's terms, not on Roland's terms, not anyone's terms, but mine. I know. And my terms include, she paused, this, here, whatever this is. I know that too, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you going to say anything else? I've been thinking about something for about 6 weeks, he said. Say it. He turned to face her fully. I've spent 20 years making a virtue of not needing anyone, telling myself that what I had, the silence, the solitude, the not having anything to lose, was discipline, that it was wisdom from the war. He looked at her steadily. It was fear, and I don't want to be afraid of this. Maren looked at him. I want to ask you something, he said, But not here, not today, not while Garrett Ashby is in my kitchen making calculations about his future. He held her gaze. Soon, when this is settled. She held his gaze for a long moment. Soon, she said. They went back inside. Deo. Dunmore spent 40 minutes in the sitting room with Garrett. When they emerged, Garrett had the look of a man who'd made peace with an outcome he couldn't change and was now focused on managing the damage. We'll agree to the independent audit and the restitution terms, Dunmore said in the careful voice of a lawyer making a record. Mr. Ashby will engage Roland Ashby's personal attorney, a man named Forsyth in Boston, within 10 days to arrange the transfer of Foundation authority. The accounting will be complete. In writing, Maren said. Signed here, witnessed by Sheriff Holt. Holt set down his coffee cup and produced paper and pen from his vest with the efficiency of a man who'd expected to be asked. It took another hour. When the papers were signed and witnessed, and Dunmore had copies, and Holt had copies, and Maren had the originals, Garrett stood and put on his coat. He looked at Maren. You're making a mistake staying here, he said. Not because of the money. Because this is a hard country, and you're a Boston woman, and I know what I am, Maren said. I've been a widow, a ward, an obligation, a scandal, a school teacher, and a partner in a Wyoming ranch. She met his eyes without blinking. I know exactly what I am. Do you? Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked out. The hard young man followed. Dunmore paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly to no one in particular, I advised him against this 3 years ago. Then he too was gone. Holt drained his coffee, set the cup in the basin, and stood. Good afternoon to you both, he said in the tone of a man filing an interesting experience away. He paused at the door. School board meets again next month. I can't promise anything, but I think the vote is going to look different, with Caldwell's patron considerably less influential in this territory. He put on his hat. Good day. The house was quiet. Walt, who had been asleep in the chair for the past hour, opened one eye. Is it over? For today, Eli said. Good. The old man closed his eye again. I'll sleep another 20 minutes then. Maren stood in the middle of Eli's kitchen, their kitchen, and looked at the table with its papers and its coffee cups and Thomas's journal, which she picked up and held in both hands. He died trying to do the right thing, she said softly. I know. I want to write that to Roland, that Thomas knew and tried to stop it, and that his instinct was right. She turned the journal over. That his son was a good man. He was, Eli said without knowing Thomas Ashby at all, but knowing the kind of man who sends his journal to his wife before a battle with instructions for how it should be used. Maren set the journal on the table. She looked at Eli. You said soon, she said. He looked at her. I'm saying it now, she said. Whatever you were going to ask, I'm saying it now. Outside, the wind moved through the basin and the mountain stood enormous and permanent against the sky, and the garden they'd planted together had gone dormant for winter, but the soil was dark and rich and ready for spring. Eli crossed the kitchen. He took both her hands in his. Stay, he said, not asking it, offering it, placing it between them like something he was willing to be responsible for. I already am, she said, permanently. He held her gaze. As my wife, not my partner, though you'll be that too, but I want to build this with you the way things are supposed to be built. With intention, with, he stopped and started again. I'm not good at this. You're doing fine. I want to stop eating alone. He said it simply, the most honest version of it. I want 2 plates on the table because we set them, not because one of us snuck into the other's kitchen. He looked at her. I want to stop being afraid of what I could lose because I have already been living in that fear for 20 years, and it has cost me everything it was supposed to protect. Maren looked at him with clear, certain eyes. Yes, she said, the simplicity of it. Yes. Eli Harding, she said. Ajisha said yes, to all of it, to the plates and the garden and the terrible Wyoming winters and the neighbors who will talk forever, and the ranch that needs more work than 2 people can probably do. And the fact that you are the most stubbornly self-sufficient man I have ever met, and I am apparently very attracted to that. She squeezed his hands. Yes. Walt Greer made a sound from the chair. They both looked at him. I'm not entirely asleep, he said from behind his closed eyes. You might want to kiss her before she changes her mind. Eli kissed her. Walt went back to sleep. They were married on a Saturday in February when the snow had laid itself across Sweetwater's basin in a clean, deep silence, and the mountains stood blue-white against a sky so clear it seemed to go on forever. It was not a large wedding. It was not supposed to be. The ceremony was in the same church where they'd sat hand in hand in the back row while the congregation cataloged their sins, and the symmetry of it was Maren's idea expressed with the particular dry satisfaction of a woman who understood the value of a precise statement. Reverend Price performed the ceremony with the expression of a man who has reviewed the available options and chosen the one least likely to result in his regret. Walt Greer stood for Eli. He wore his Sunday clothes and his most imposing mustache and looked at anyone who tried to make a comment with the withering patience of a 70-year-old man who had survived a great deal more than this. Widow LaRue stood for Maren and did so with a warmth that made clear she had decided Maren Ashby was among the best things to happen to this basin in recent memory. Perkins and Drake and 3 other ranchers from their coalition attended along with a handful of townspeople who had decided that whatever their opinions in October, they had an interest in maintaining a cordial relationship with the woman who had just successfully brought a fraud case against a Boston family and the man who'd helped her do it. The pews were half full. The people who came were the right ones. Eli said his vows looking at Maren's face, which was composed and certain and more beautiful to him than it had ever been, not despite the 6 weeks of fence mending and cold watches and stitching Walt's ribs and facing Garrett Ashby across a kitchen table, but because of them. He had learned her face in difficulty and found it extraordinary. Maren said hers looking back at him with the particular clarity of someone who had made a decision by surviving it. I promise to stay, she said, through every season, through every argument. We will certainly have through the years when this is hard and the years when it's harder. I promise to tend what we're building the way we tend the garden, with patience and stubbornness and the understanding that some things require a whole winter underground before they're ready to show themselves. When it was over and the small congregation stood to applaud, Walt Greer whistled through his teeth in a way that suggested he approved comprehensively. The school board met in March. Mrs. Caldwell was not in attendance. Her departure from the board had been, as Sheriff Holt had delicately phrased it, encouraged by the discovery that the primary donor behind several of her community initiatives had been Harlan Voss, whose standing in the territory was now significantly diminished. Voss himself had not appeared at the March session of the territorial court, which Judge Kramer had noted with the official patience of a man who would be issuing warrants. The remaining board members voted to reinstate Maren Harding, née Ashby, as the teacher of the Sweetwater Basin Schoolhouse, effective upon the completion of the cottage repairs that had now been pending since October. The vote was unanimous. Maren received this news at the kitchen table where she was writing her weekly letter to Roland Ashby in Boston, and she read the official notice twice with a carefully neutral expression and then set it down and went directly to the garden. Eli found her there 20 minutes later, turning the thawed soil with a spade, preparing the bed for the planting season's first round. "You heard," he said. "I heard." She drove the spade in. "I'm going to grow more beans this year." "Maren," she stopped and straightened and looked at him. Her eyes were bright with something she was barely keeping contained. "I'm going to grow more beans," she said, "and teach 42 children whose families have been in this basin since before I arrived and stand in front of that schoolhouse every morning and know I'm there because I chose it and earned it." She held his gaze. "Not because anyone permitted it, because I fought for it." He looked at her for a moment. "That's what you needed to say." "Yes." "All right." He picked up the second spade. "You're putting the beans in the wrong section again." She threw a small piece of frozen soil at him. He caught of it. She laughed. The letter from Silas Forsythe, Roland Ashby's personal attorney in Boston, arrived on a Tuesday in late March, 3 weeks after Judge Kramer's court had issued a subpoena for Garrett Ashby to present the foundation's financial records under oath. Forsythe's letter was 4 pages precise and measured, and it told 2 things. Roland Ashby had died on the 14th of February, which was 3 days after Eli and Maren's wedding in his house on Beacon Hill, with the letter Maren had written to him on his bedside table. And in the codicil to his will added in January after Maren's letter and the accounting request had arrived, Roland had amended the original inheritance terms. The $60,000 remained. The Beacon Hill property remained. The foundation chairmanship remained. The conditions did not. "He removed them," Maren said. She was at the kitchen table, both hands flat on either side of the letter. All of them. The residency requirement. The quarterly meetings, everything. She looked up. He wrote to Forsyth that he'd been wrong to try to bring me back by obligation, and that Thomas had always said I was the most capable person he knew, and that capability shouldn't require a leash. Eli sat down. He left everything to me outright, she said. No conditions, no terms, just the inheritance and a note in the codicil that says... She had to stop for a moment. When she continued, her voice was controlled, but barely. It says I hope she is happy wherever she has chosen. Thomas would want that. The kitchen was very quiet. He knew, Maren said. He knew. She closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, they were clear. The $60,000. Yes. I want to do 3 things with it. She looked at him steadily. I want to fund the foundation properly, hire independent administrators, ensure the workers have what Roland intended them to have. I want to pay for the schoolhouse repairs, here a proper building, not a patch job, and a pause. I want to buy the north pasture from Voss when it goes to territorial auction. Eli stopped. Voss is finished in this basin, she said. Kramer has the evidence, the warrants are issued, and the word from Holt is that Voss is already in discussion with his lawyers about a negotiated settlement that involves selling off his holdings. She held Eli's gaze. The north pasture has the best access to the creek and twice the grazing acreage of what we have now. If we acquire it before the consortium from Cheyenne that's been circling, we double the herd, Eli said slowly. By next winter, yes. She held his gaze. It's a significant investment. I want your agreement before I commit. He looked at her across the kitchen table, this woman who had arrived in his house with a paring knife and 2 plates and 20 years of someone else's plans for her life, and who had, over the course of a Wyoming winter, rebuilt herself from the ground up with the same methodical patience she brought to frozen soil. Our money, he said. Our decision. She nodded. Then yes, he said. Buy the pasture. The papers for the north pasture went through in May, when the snow was off the mountains and the creek was running clear and strong through the newly defined boundary of the Harding Ranch. The seller was Voss's attorney settling the estate of a man who had accepted a territorial plea arrangement that involved forfeiture of his largest holdings and a quiet departure from Wyoming that most people seemed to find satisfactory. Maren signed the deed at Holt's office on a Tuesday afternoon with Eli beside her, and afterward they walked down the main street of Sweetwater Basin in the spring sun, and nobody said anything unpleasant. It was, Eli thought, a remarkable improvement. Summer settled over the basin like something earned. The schoolhouse was completed in June, a proper building, stone foundation, good windows, a stove that worked, a roof that didn't leak. Maren stood in the empty classroom on the first morning after the construction crew left and turned slowly, looking at the chalkboard and the rows of benches in the single large window that caught the morning light and threw it across the floor in a long yellow rectangle. Eli stood in the doorway and watched her. What are you thinking? He asked. That I'm going to need more chalk, she said, and that the benches need to be arranged differently, and that I want to hang a map on the east wall. She turned to face him, and that I can't believe it's real. It's real. I know. She looked at the classroom again. I know, I just want to say it out loud while I believe it. He crossed the room and stood beside her. I want to tell you something, she said. All right. She reached into her dress pocket and took out Thomas Ashby's pocket watch. She held it in her palm for a moment, the cracked crystal face catching the light. I wound it every day for 2 years, she said. She trying to make time move because I was afraid if I stopped, I'd be admitting it was really over. That he was really gone, and the life I expected was really gone, and I'd really have to figure out what came next. She turned the watch over. I think I've been winding it past the point where it was helping me, and into the point where it was keeping me stuck. She looked up at him. I'm going to stop winding it. Eli was quiet. I'm not going to stop carrying it, she said. It was his. He held it. It matters. She closed her hand around it. But I don't need to keep trying to make the hands move. No, Eli said, you don't. She put the watch back in her pocket. Right, she said, the benches need to be in a semicircle. They're in rows. Rows are for passive listening. I want the children facing each other. The school board specified rows. The school board can come move them back themselves. She looked at him. Help me with the benches. He moved benches for an hour in the June heat, while Maren directed with the authority of a woman who knew exactly how she wanted her classroom to work. And the light came through the large window and fell across the new floor. And outside, the cottonwoods by the creek were in full leaf, and it was the kind of morning that doesn't announce itself as important, but that you remember for the rest of your life. Autumn came back around, not with the same desperation, not with the tight, braced quality of a man who'd spent 20 years waiting for winter to be hard. Eli noticed the difference, the way he noticed it in the garden. Things that had been dormant or carefully dead were putting out new growth, and the new growth was against all reasonable expectation holding. They were in the garden on an October evening. The beans had come in fully, and the tomatoes had been extraordinary. And Maren was already planning the following year's planning with the enthusiasm of a woman who'd discovered she was very good at growing things, when Maren sat back on her heels and looked at him. I want to tell you something, she said. You say that a lot. You never object. I never will. She looked at him with the expression that meant she was choosing her words. When I came here, she said, I thought I was running away from something, and I was, but I was also running toward something I didn't know I needed, which was the chance to find out what I was made of when nobody was watching me. She paused. I found out. What are you made of? She thought about it. Stubbornness, she said, impracticality, and an unreasonable attachment to growing things in difficult soil. She looked at him, and the capacity to be surprised. By what? By the fact that the man I asked to let me sleep by his fire turned out to be the person I was looking for. She held his gaze. I wasn't looking. I want to be clear. I had no intention of. I know. But here we are. Here we are. She turned back to the garden, which was going dormant, now the last of the summer exhausted and the soil readying itself for winter. She pressed her hand flat into the dark earth and held it there. It'll be better next year, she said. I know what it needs now. Gardens take time, Eli said. So do people. She looked at her hand in the soil, but they get there. He sat down beside her in the dirt of his mother's garden, their garden, and looked at the mountains going gold in the last of the afternoon light, and the basins spreading wide and windswept below them, and the house behind them with its lamplight already on in the kitchen and 2 plates waiting on the table. Eli, Maren said, I'm happy. Then he looked at her. She was looking at the garden, her hands still in the dark soil, her face quiet and open and entirely certain. So am I, he said. She turned to look at him. The sun was in her eyes, catching the copper threads in her hair, and the garden smelled of autumn and turned earth and everything that was going to come back in spring. Good, she said. Then let's go in. I made supper and it's getting cold. He stood and helped her up, and they walked through the garden and across the yard and through the door of the house that had been his for 20 years and was now theirs, and the kitchen was warm, and the supper was ready, and the 2 plates were on the table the way they had been every evening since the October night a woman had walked into his solitude and set a second place without asking permission. Because she'd known something he hadn't in those first moments, when she'd looked at him without fear across a steaming stew, that the bravest thing a lonely person can do is not endure alone but choose differently. She had chosen, and in the end so had he. And every night from that day forward there were 2 plates on the table, not because circumstances required it, not because there was nowhere else to go, because they had chosen it each and every evening deliberately together, and they went on choosing it until choosing it was so deeply part of them that they could no longer imagine what it meant to be themselves without the other. The garden came back in spring, as gardens do. And so did they.